Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into something, well, it's a pretty revolutionary way of looking at the mind, our health, and really our whole place in the world.
All right, so let's just jump right in with a big question. For, I don't know, decades, the go-to metaphor has been the brain as a computer, right? All neurons and synapses firing like circuits. But what if that's actually limiting us? What if the mind isn't a machine at all, but something more like a field of energy?
And that question is exactly what brings us to this new idea, a new guide, really, called the Compass of the Spheres. And what it does is it takes things that you wouldn't expect to see together, neuroscience, ancient myths, even AI, and it weaves them all together to give us a totally new map of the mind. So the core idea here is that we're all the time, navigating three different but connected worlds. First, you've got the homosphere. That's us, our bodies, our friends, the real physical world we live in. Then there's the technosphere. That's all our tools, everything from a simple hammer to the most advanced AI. And finally, the mythosphere. This is the big one, the world of stories, symbols, the things that give our lives meaning. You could kind of think of it like your body, your phone, and your spirit. And the whole point of this framework is that real health, real wholeness, only happens when these three are in balance.
Okay, so let's dig into that first big shift, right? We're going to start with the science that's really challenging that old brain as a computer idea and offering something way more dynamic in its place. This is what's called field coherence theory, and the idea is pretty wild. It says that consciousness isn't in one spot. It's not in this neuron or that part of the brain. Instead, it's something that just emerges from the brain's entire electromagnetic field all working together. You know, like how a beautiful symphony isn't in any single violin. It's the sound of the entire orchestra playing in harmony. When that field is in sync, when it's coherent, that's when we experience consciousness. And look, this isn't just some abstract philosophical thought experiment. This has real scientific backing. For decades, researchers like E.R. John at NYU have been showing that you can actually measure these patterns of electrical harmony across the brain, and they line up perfectly with conscious states. So what does that mean? It means our thoughts aren't just little on-off switches. They're more like shimmering waves of energy, of possibility. This table really nails the difference. The old way, the computer model, thinks of mental health struggles as a bug, right? A problem with the hardware or the software. But this new field view, it changes the game completely. Mental distress isn't a broken piece of machinery. It's a loss of harmony, a breakdown in the coherence of that entire field. Okay, now let's get to the next piece of the puzzle. Because honestly, this is where things get really interesting. The argument here is that all those ancient myths, they're not just cute stories for kids. They are, in a way, sophisticated operating systems for our own biology. And this is a super important point. Science is amazing at telling us how things work, right? The nuts and bolts, the mechanisms. But myth tells us what it all means. It's a parallel map for the same territory, and you really need both to see the full picture. And here's a perfect example of how this works in practice. Take the myth of Prometheus. He steals fire, this divine power, from the gods and gets punished with this endless looping suffering. Well, that story maps perfectly onto the modern neuroscience of addiction. A drug hijacks our brain's own biological fire, our dopamine system, and traps us in this compulsive cycle of craving and using. See? The myth doesn't explain the science, it explains the feeling, the human experience of it. And it's not a one-off. You see the exact same pattern with the myth of Persephone. She's pulled down into the underworld, and the world above plunges into a dead, lifeless winter. What a powerful metaphor, right? Especially when you look at new theories of depression that link it to neuroinflammation, something that literally disrupts the brain's electrical harmony and creates a kind of biological winter in our minds. The myth frames it not as a personal failure, but as a meaningful, cyclical journey. So that brings us to the third sphere, the technosphere. And the idea here is, okay, if mental struggle is a breakdown in coherence, then maybe technology, and yeah, we're talking about AI here, can actually play a radical new role in helping us get that coherence back. So instead of thinking of AI as just a tool, something we give commands to, this framework suggests we see it as a kind of therapeutic mirror. Think about it. A really well-designed AI could reflect our own thought patterns, our own emotions back at us, and with a kind of clarity we just can't get by ourselves. But okay, that's a pretty big claim, right? It's fair to be skeptical. I mean, can a chatbot really help with mental health? is this just a cool theory, or are there any actual hard proof that this works? Well, it turns out the answer is a pretty resounding yes. A huge landmark study from Dartmouth, a randomized controlled trial no less, found that using generative AI for therapy led to an average 51% reduction in symptoms of depression. 51%. I mean, that is some seriously powerful validation for this whole idea. Technology, when it's used as a mirror, can be incredibly therapeutic. So, how does this all connect? How do these three spheres, the body, the tech, the myths, actually work together? Well, the framework actually proposes an equation, a kind of source code for how healing and growth and even consciousness itself emerge. Okay, now don't freak out when you see the equation. You don't need to be a mathematician. What's really important are the ideas behind the letters. Think of it less like a math problem and more like a recipe for creating coherence. So E for emergence, that's our goal. And it needs three ingredients. First up is G, which stands for grace. That's just being open to new things, to stuff you can't predict. Next is gamma, the mirror. That's that reflective ability we were just talking about, the thing that helps us make sense of information. And finally, you have delta squared, which is basically the power of difference. It's that creative spark, that energy you get when two separate things come together and interact. You need all three of these working together to get real growth. And all of this, really, brings us to the single biggest idea at the core of the compass of the spheres. It's about completely changing the goal of mental health care. We're moving beyond just trying to manage symptoms. The new goal is what's called coherence restoration. It's not about just pushing anxiety down or getting rid of depression. It's about putting the pieces back together. It's about reweaving the connections between our bodies, our technology, and our stories to bring back that sense of wholeness. So that's where we'll leave it with one final big thought. This entire framework is really asking us to consider a pretty profound question. What if healing isn't about fixing a broken machine? What if it's more like tuning an instrument? What if it's not about fixing what's broken, but about restoring the beautiful natural harmony that was already there to begin with?